What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into the top 5 meta decks currently in Magic the Gathering Arena Standard Best of 1. These decks currently are the highest win rated decks. They have a lot of games played, so their win rates does speak for themselves. I may have already also piloted one of these decks, as it is something that I saw on the rise as was happening, and now it's kind of made its way to the top. But with that being said, we'll kind of go into each list. We'll talk about its strengths, what matchups are their strengths when it comes to each of these deck lists. We'll go over the deck lists themselves, and there are some variances depending on where you look into each deck list, and we'll talk about that as well. But with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. With the release of Streets of New Capenna, we did get an introduction into the Esper Aggro deck. This essentially what it did was it actually splashed in black and blue mana into the mono white shell, and we got a little bit more of a control-y kind of style to the deck, and we kind of played around some of the new cards currently in Streets of New Capenna. Right now this deck sits about at a 57.6 win rate with about 18,000 matches played. Average duration's probably about 5.5 minutes, and there has been too many iterations on the deck, as the version you see here is pretty much the one you will see across the board. So it is one of two versions, and the strengths of this deck are against the little bit of the slower mid-rangey to endgame decks, the controls, the mid-ranges, decks that take a little bit of time to set up, but this deck is one of those decks that kind of can do its way. Against some of the meta decks as a standpoint, it struggles against the mono white aggro, it struggles against the Boros Burn, it struggles against the Naya Humans, so that's kind of why it's probably not at the top of the list or near the top of the list, as those decks do perform probably better against those decks. But with that being said, like I said, this deck isn't anything you haven't seen before. It kind of looks like mono white, like I said, other than those two cards that kind of splash in for the black and the blue, with the Rufine and also the Obscura Interceptor as being kind of like a little bit of a bounce spell in a sense. I mean, granted, it's kind of like an additional spell that mono white can use, or Esper could use, to kind of control what your opponent's doing on their side of the field, whether it be spell and or creatures. But overall, the deck list is going to be something you may have seen in mono white. Starting in the 1-drop slot, we have the Hopeful Initiate as a 1-drop 1/2 with training. You can tap 3, remove 2 counters from any creatures we control, and we destroy target artifact or enchantment. So if anyone has, like, you're playing against enchantments, or your opponent has some sort of artifact like a Seeker's Chariot, you can use you can remove counters and destroy that artifact and or enchantment. Then you have Luminarch Aspirant, yet again another staple in any shells that are aggro, and they also play mono white. It's going to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we can at the beginning of combat. We're going to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature a creature we control. Sun Guild Sentinel, yet again, kind of a card I feel like mono white had in the main list at one point, but in this deck, because we have variances of power, 2 mana 3/2, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, we have to exile up to 1 target card from graveyard, which is good. There could be strategies where people flash things back, or they have ways of getting things back, anything with Shigeki or something like that. This can kind of slowly remove those cards from the graveyard so they can't get those cards back. The other ability here is it does have the Covenant ability. If you do get 3 different creatures of different powers, you can tap 2 mana, choose a color, and it gets hexproof from that color until end of turn, and it can't be blocked by creatures of that turn. So it doesn't have protection of that color, it just has hexproof, and creatures of that color can't block it. So it's kind of like a weird protection, but it's not technically a protection in that sense. Other than that, it's an overall pretty good 3/2 for 2 mana, which is definitely good. We have Talia's Guardian of the Thraben. Yet again, a strong card that helps these decks that play mono white kind of slow down those mid-range to endgame decks, as it's going to tax those non-creature spells that your opponent could play against this, like removal and other spells like that, make them cost 1 more. So, if they had a 3-drop and you're on the play, this is definitely going to make their turn 3 not work the way they wanted, or even their turn 2, because now that, maybe that spot removal spell now costs 3 mana instead of 2 mana, and Thalia is good for that. Looking at the 3-drop slot, we have the Brutal Cathar. This card is very strong in any of these mono white shells, in the Boros Burn, in the mono white aggro. It's definitely a strong card in the sense that it just kind of removes a creature that's in your way from the battlefield until Brutal Cathar leaves the battlefield, and it can flip around and gets the 3/3 for a striker. So if your opponent doesn't play a lot of spells, you're going to all of a sudden have a 3/3 for a striker, and then if you're able to flip it back, you get to remove something else and kind of repeat that process yet again until Brutal Cathar leaves the battlefield. Elite Spellbinder, you get to take a peek at what your opponent is doing. Look at their hand, you get to choose a card in that hand and exile it, and essentially that card now has attacks of 2 more to cast, so it doesn't come in the battlefield on the turn that initially the converted mana cost is has. So if you take a 2-drop, turn it into a 4-drop, take a 3-drop, turn it into a 5-drop. Overall, it helps you slow down what your opponent's doing. And yet again, it's a 3/1 flyer, so it is definitely very good in the aggro sense, as it can fly over a lot of what goes on the ground game. Then we have Adeline, yet again another great card for this deck. As we do play Rafine, it's a 3-mana *4 based on the power of how many creatures we have on the battlefield, and every time we attack, we have to create a 1/1 white human creature token that's on the battlefield tapped and attacking, and then you can choose a planeswalker or the player that you want that creature to attack, which is definitely very good. And it also has vigilance, so it doesn't need to tap to attack, which you can leave it back for defense, which is also pretty awesome. Then we have Rafine. I think this is definitely a strong card. You're going to see a lot of this card post-rotation, as I think it's going to be one of those mainstay cards in some sort of Esper shell in that sense, in an aggro sense. Maybe some of the shell will stay together. We'll lose a couple of the pieces, but this is a great card as a 3-mana 1/4 of flying and a ward of 1. Because we play other cards attacks, your opponent's spells. Now they pay another additional 1 on top of what they would already pay to, maybe spot removal it. But whenever we attack, target attacking creature connives for X, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So if you attack with 1 creature, you connive for 1, which you draw 1, discard a card. If you just draw a non-land permanent card, you're going to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. Over time, even attacking for 1, 2, 3 creatures at a time, conniving for possibility up to 3 +1/+1 counters can get like Rafine out of a hairy situation like a Meathook Massacre very quickly, as it's going to cost them that much more to then Meathook Massacre. Overall, very, very strong card and a very, very good card for an aggro deck. Then in the 4-drop slot, we have a couple copies of the Wandering Emperor. I know I have alternate art here, but essentially Wandering Emperor is a planeswalker that has flash, which is definitely very powerful. The +1 ability gives target creature +1/+1 and first strike until end of turn, so you can sneak it out on an opponent, block a creature, give it first strike, and all of a sudden kill their creature before it deals damage to you with the first strike ability. We can -1 create a 2/2 Samurai Vigilance creature, or we can just -2 straight up and just exile that creature, get it off the battlefield, out of the game, and then we gain 2 life in the process if we need that life gain, or just want to get rid of the possibility of a threat that could always come back. Overall, making Wandering Emperor a very, very strong card and works very well in this deck as it is on the aggro side, but kind of gets into that, not as aggressive aggro, but more into that mid-rangey aggro style of a deck. Then we have Aspira Interceptor, a 4-mana 3/1 with lifelink and flash, and then when it enters the battlefield, it connives. When it connives this way, return up to 1 target spell to its owner's hand, so you kind of use it as like a counter spell in a way. It allows you to kind of, prevent maybe a Meathook Massacre that will wipe board out. It can use to get rid of a spot removal spell and make them having to recast it. If they tapped out fully for it, then they can't recast it this turn, essentially wasting what they would have done on that turn. And if you connive and hit a non-basic land yet again, it becomes a 4/2 with lifelink, and lifelink could become pretty essential when it comes to this deck. Overall, very, very good card, and works very, very, very well with the shell. Mana base is pretty straightforward for an Esper deck. We have a lot of non-basics. That's kind of the way these 3-color decks have kind of gone, and a lot of decks have gone currently in the current standard, making it susceptible to any sort of land destruction deck, as we play a few basics, but not enough to kind of combat a possibility of going against land destruction. We have 2 copies of the Cave of the Frost Dragon, 1 copy of Aganjo, 1 Plains, 1 of Ottawara, Sorin City. We have 1 Hive Tyrant. We have 3 Deserted Beaches. We have 4 of the blue-white pathway, 4 copies of the black-white pathway, 3 copies of the Shattered Sanctum, the black-white duel. We have 1 copy of the Shipwreck March, the blue-black duel, and then we have 4 copies of the Rafine's Tower, which is, a great triumph as it counts as a plains, island, and swamp, as well as you can always cycle it for 3 at the downside of it does come into the battlefield tapped, but overall very strong land for the current meta. Definitely a good deck. Like I said, this deck is kind of like on the downturn. It was a very popular deck when Streets of New Capenna came out, but we've seen other decks kind of pop up and kind of take over its spot. It's right now sitting also at a popularity of about a percent of the meta is currently playing it, making it a little bit of a weaker deck currently in the current standard, but it's still definitely a good deck. Has an overall decent win percentage if you're just looking to win. But yet again, if you're looking for something maybe different than the top meta deck, this could be a possibility if you like these colors. So the next deck up on the list is a deck that I feel like people kind of dislike when it comes to facing it, as it is a little bit of that very clunky, kind of clicky kind of deck, and that is Naya Runes. Naya Runes is currently sitting at number 4 in the meta with a 57.8 win rate, which is slightly above the Esper Aggro deck in about 57,000 played matches. There's definitely multiple iterations of this deck. There's probably about 25 currently just within Untapped, and that's usually just, add in 1 additional copy of this, taking out 1 additional copy of that. I'm sure there's versions of it that play the 4-mana enchantment spell that whenever you cast an enchantment, you get the tokens in the process. But the current most popular version of the deck currently is not playing that enchantment. It's just more so focusing on getting out your runes and kind of overpowering your opponent that way. And that's probably typical because that deck, the other version that plays the 4-mana enchantment, is a little bit slower, and with the top meta being super aggressive, you kind of want to get your early game up and run as quick as possible. Its weakest matchups are against, yet again, decks that are better than it, like the Mono Whites, the Boros Burn, the Naya Humans, though it does do pretty well against Esper in that sense, that it's slightly better against Esper, slightly above a 50%, which is definitely good. So that's why it's, slightly above the deck, that I just went over before it. And the games do, can take a while. It is about a 6.1 minutes to take a game. But overall, it's still a very strong deck. It's not an expensive deck, to say the least. The lands are probably the most expensive thing about the deck, as the deck doesn't really run a ton of rares and mythics in the main board other than the lands. We got a lot of good cards from Kamigawa, the first one being Generous Visitor, a 1-mana 1/1, that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we get to put +1/+1 counter on target creature, whether itself or another creature we control. We have a couple circle containments, try to slow down what our opponent could do, especially with the meta, like I said, being very aggressive. This is definitely a good card, slowing your opponent down and slowing their creatures down, not allowing them to, get momentum of playing a bunch of creatures and overpowering you that way. So Circle of Attainment's definitely a good card there. We have Rune of Sustenance. Yet again, life gain's very good against these more aggressive decks that are currently in the format. Gain of life kind of slows down the process of them killing you. Rune of Speed gives any creature that we attach this to and or land the ability to have haste and +1/+0. Then we have Kami of Transcience, a 2-mana 2/2 with trample, that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we put a +1/+1 counter on Kami. At the beginning of each end step, if an enchantment was put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, we get to bring Kami back from the graveyard to our hand, which is definitely good. So it has some sort of recurrence, which is pretty good, especially against, if you have to throw it in front of something just to block and absorb some damage. You have Rune of Might, a 2-mana enchantment rune that gives target creature or permanent, I should say, +1/+1 and trample, which allows us to get kind of over chump blockers. That's kind of how this deck kind of performs very, very well. Giving things trample that normally wouldn't have trample is definitely a good way to get in through for damage. You have Jukai Naturalist, a 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink. Enchantment spells we cast cost 1 less to cast. If we combine that with the next card over it, it makes all our rune cards essentially cost free, and it makes our Showdown of the Skulls just cost of red and white mana, which is definitely very good there. And yet again, this is a good target to put some runes on, because making this bigger will allow us to get chunks of life as well without having the Rune of Sustenance. Other than that, we have the Runeforged Champion, a 3-mana 2/3 Dwarf Warrior that when it enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for or graveyard for a rune card, reveal it, put it into our hand, and then shuffle, and then we may pay 1 rather than pay the mana cost of a rune spell. And like I said, combine that with Kami, our Jukai the Naturalist, it essentially makes that rune free, and then we don't have to pay any mana, and essentially we get free runes and allows us to dig it a little bit bigger very, very quickly. After that, we do have the mana base. Yet again, we are just playing this pretty straightforward. We have 1 Cave of the Frost Dragon, 4 of the Plains, 1 of the Den of the Bugbear, 5 copies of a Forest. We have 1 Layer of the Hydro. Yet again, you can target this with runes, so every time you tap X in a green, it becomes a creature and then gains the abilities of all the runes that are attached to it, which is definitely very good. If you need to draw a card and you need somewhere to put the runes to kind of get yourself built up momentum-wise. We have 4 of the green-red pathways. We have 4 of the white-red pathways. We have also 4 of the white-green pathways. Yet again, like I said, the only thing that's really expensive about the deck is really the mana base. The rest of the deck itself, why it's, I think, also a very prominent deck is because it doesn't cost a lot. You can get away with probably playing a little bit more of the non-basics or even tap duels. This deck is very good, very, very powerful. There is a reason why it was a top deck even before Streets of New Capenna, because it was that good. Current trends with the deck, I think, are on the downturn just because other decks have kind of gotten a lot more popular over time with Streets of New Capenna. It's right now sitting about 5% of the meta currently are playing this deck. Though at one point, I think before even Streets of New Capenna, right after, I think when it initially, launched itself to the top of the meta, it was about, at about a 12% play rate in the current standard. But yet again, it's still a deck that performs very, very well. There hasn't been too much that kind of slows it down. Yet again, we'll kind of have to wait and see if other decks develop around it and see how it, maybe changes direction, or if there's other ways that it can become a much better deck. So the next deck up on the list is going to be the Mono White Aggro. This is a deck that's kind of just been existing in the top of the meta. It has gotten some additional cards as sets have released, but it's been the top deck or in the top of the meta since its kind of like rise to fame in the beginning of September of last year. Overall, this deck is definitely very good. It's a very, very strong deck. It's at about 58.4% win rate overall, 110,000 matches played, which means it's definitely seen, you know, a good chunk of matches to really determine whether or not it's a good deck. Average game is a little over 5 minutes at 5.2 minutes. There have been many iterations at 53 different deck versions over that time. As you know, we get new cards, you kind of add new cards to the deck. I think in its current iteration, this deck that I have in front of you currently plays 0 new cards from Streets of New Capenna, which is definitely very interesting. So it is a deck that kind of hasn't really got any new tools with Streets of New Capenna. When you kind of remove colors, you know, you don't really see, as I think when you look at the white cards that got introduced to Streets of New Capenna, the cards just don't synergize very well with the mono white aggro deck. But overall, the deck is definitely a very good deck, and there's a reason why it's kind of in the top 3 of the meta. You know, a lot of the same players you see in the mono white deck. You have the Hopeful Initiate here at the 1 mana 1/2 train in. You can remove 2 counters from creatures you control and destroy target artifact or enchantment. You got Usher the Fallen, 2/1 for 1 mana with the boast ability that you can create a 1/1 white human creature token if you have open mana and have nothing to do with it. Intrepid Adversary, and if you have any additional mana after you cast it for initial cost, you can pay 2 mana and then put +1 plus put a loyalty counter on this, and for each time we pay that mana, creatures we control essentially will get +1/+1, making them much bigger, making them more threatening, which makes this card very, very good. And it itself also has lifelink, which makes it also very good for, you know, blocking and getting a little bit of life out of it. We also have a Luminarch Aspirant, you know, yet again, gets to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control at the beginning of our combat step, making it a very good staple card in aggro decks that play white. Got Thalia, yet again, for the decks that play spells that are a little bit more expensive, making this deck much better against the more mid-rangey / control decks of the format. 2/1 First Striker, and making non-creature spells cost 1 more, slows down what your opponent could be doing against you. Brutal Cathar also shows up here in the list. A 3 mana 2/2, enters battlefield, we get to exile target creature and opponent controls. Also starts a Nightbound, Daybound cycle, which is also very good. Penalizes your opponent for not playing anything, as it can flip if no spells were cast during a turn, and it also has First Strike and Ward of 3 by paying 3 life in order to actually target with a spell, and it's a 3/3. Overall, very, very strong card. Lead Spellbinder, attacking your opponent's hand, taking a spell that they could be playing on the following turn after you play this, and taxing it out until like the next 2 turns away. Definitely a strong card. Also has flying, which is very good. Got Redain here, God of the Worthy. If you think your opponent's playing a deck that's a little bit on the slower side, Redain's definitely very good. It makes any spell that costs 4 or more cost 2 more to cast. Worst case scenario, you can always pay the 4 mana, which is still a good ability. You can play the Valkylma, Protector Shield for 4 mana. If a sorcery your opponent control would deal damage to a permanent you control, prevent that damage. So it turns off any like small tokens, so any 1/1 tokens don't do anything against you and or creatures you control. Also, if whenever another permanent you control becomes target a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell unless they pay an additional 1. So yet again, the Protector Shield gives even more protection to things you control, though it is not going to prevent you from any sort of board wipe like a Meathook Massacre or Depopulate. But yet again, a very, very strong card for maybe things that play like direct removal and things like that. Also to note, if we turn on any of our creature lands, it also protects them as well, as making our opponent having to pay that additional 1 if they want to target it. Yet again, mono white, we're going to play Adeline here because we are playing a bunch of creatures, not a lot of spells. You know, it's a star at 4, it's +1/+1, or +1/+0 for each creature we control, and whenever we attack, create a creature that's a 1/1 and tapped and attack, and that can attack a planeswalker and or the player, just creating more additional pressure, which your opponent has to kind of deal with if they can't. Other than that, we also have 1 copy of Legion Angel, allowing us to go into our sideboard, where all we have are just additional copies of Legion Angel, making it kind of allowing us to kind of keep that tempo going of at least dropping a 4/3 at least a turn if we don't have any other plays, which is definitely very good. And we also play 4 copies of Warden, the Wandering Emperor. Yet again, a very, very strong Planeswalker. I think this is the combat against other aggressive decks, as we can exile those creatures. We can give our creatures +1/+1 and First Strike if we need to block those creatures. Or if we just need to put a blocker onto the battlefield, we can create a 2/2 Samurai Vigilance creature. Or if we need to just turn on the pressure a little bit, we can also create the creature to get more pressure out on the battlefield. Mana base is pretty straightforward. You got 3 copies of Cave of the Frost Dragon. We got 2 copies of Aganjo, Seed of the Empire. Yet again, a land that can be a land source and also deal damage to an opponent if we need to. As like I said, this deck doesn't play a lot of ways to remove things other than what the creatures do other than the creatures we have in the deck. 16 planes, which is definitely very good, as allows us not to get worried, get taken over by a land destruction deck. We got Crawling Barrens yet again because of Faceless Haven being banned. That's why a lot of your mono white decks that shifted away from playing Snowlands, and that's why we now play Crawling Barrens. I've seen other versions play additional Cave of the Frost Dragons. There's also, I think, the other land, I can't think of the name, that's just like Crawling Barrens that you can turn on for colorless mana, which makes it pretty good. And then we also have Field of Ruin if we need to combat our opponent's lands as well, and get rid of maybe one of their creature lands, which is definitely something that is a possibility. But overall, this deck has been the mainstay in the meta. It's kind of sat at the top for the longest time. I think it is on the downtrend just because there's been other decks that have been kind of taken over, being a little bit more on the aggressive, doing a lot that this deck can't do. As it is just a mono white deck, it can't really be overly aggressive, as it can't put a lot of pressure out immediately. Like, you don't play a creature and immediately attack in with it. You kind of have to play it. Hopefully it survives the turn, and then you get to start doing what it does the turn after. Currently, it's on the downtrend. Like I said, it's about 5% of the current meta is playing this deck. But yet again, it's still a very, very strong deck. If you're playing this deck already, I think this deck is still going to perform very, very well, as the win rate has not really fluctuated whatsoever. It's sat about at this, 58% for the longest time. And that's the reason why is this deck has been so refined that it's just overall good in that sense. So this next deck on the list is kind of like Esper deck, is kind of now taking mono white and splash it in Naya colors, and that is Naya Humans. Overall, this has been another deck that's been kind of on the mainstay, kind of at the top of the meta for quite a while. I think, I don't know if it's been at the top. It's been kind of 1-2 with mono white, but overall it's still a very, very good deck. Like I said, it is kind of essentially like mono white splash some Naya. This is a little bit more than, say, the Esper deck, as there are a few more cards that are of more colors in this deck, and the mana base is a little bit more diverse in that sense. And we're also kind of doing a few other things that maybe you've not seen in a mono white deck, as this deck, like for example, does play Valorous Stance, which is definitely very good. But yet again, we're kind of trying to do some other things. We're trying to play a tribal deck, playing around humans. Is another thing of the deck, and we get to play the Secluded Courtyard, which is a colorless land that enters the battlefield. We get to choose a creature type, and we can either tap it for colorless mana, or we can add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana to only cast creature spells or of the chosen type, or activate abilities of a creature, or a creature card of the chosen type. So definitely a cool little land that's kind of like a multi-purpose dual triome, essentially, because it can be used to create, cast any of our humans in the deck, which is definitely very good, and something you can't, I guess, essentially do in a mono white, because mono whites play like spirits and things like that, and other creatures of types of that sort. But yet again, in the 1-drop slot, Hopeful Initiate makes its place. Strong 1-drop, especially in any decks that splash white, it only grows bigger. So every creature that we attack in with it, other than itself, will essentially make this card that much bigger. Or we can just put counters on it in general with like our Luminarch Aspirant, and just make it an overall big creature, and has a slightly bigger toughness than its power. Then we also have Intrepid Adversary, yet again a staple in decks that play white. A 2-mana 3/1 with lifelink. It's also a human. When it enters the battlefield, we pay that 2 mana any amount of times that we can pay it. We get to put we get to put a Valor counter on it for each time we paid that additional mana, and creatures we control get +1/+1 for each Valor counter on Adversary. Then we got Luminarch Aspirant, of 4 copies of in the deck. It's going to give creatures we control +1/+1 until at the beginning of our combat, which is definitely very good, making our creatures that much stronger. Got Thalia to tax maybe what your opponent is doing, making their non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. So if they have any sort of way to slow you down, it's now going to make them pay additional 1 in order to do so. Valorous Stance, and either to give something indestructible, or to get rid of something with a toughness 4 or greater, which is definitely good removal. And that's something that mono white lacks when it comes to direct removal. Definitely a good card that kind of works with what we're trying to do in the deck. Yeah, Brutal Cathar, 3 mana. Yet again, it's a card that's going to enter the battlefield or transform it into Brutal Cathar, exile target creature and opponent controls until this creature leaves the battlefield. Strong card, kind of gets rid of something pesky in our way. It is also a human. It is also flipped over to a werewolf, so you don't get the benefits of it being a human during the werewolf side, but still a very, very strong other side of the deck. It's a 3/3 for a striker with ward of 3 life, and then it flips back and forth depending on the nightbound daybound cycle. Elite Spellbinder is also here in this deck because, yet again, it's another card that's been a staple of these decks that play a lot of mono white cards. At 3 mana 3/1, tax something in your opponent's hand, making it cost 2 more to cast, which is definitely very good. Slows them down for doing whatever they want to do, possibly on curve. Get Adeline here at 3 cast in cost, star 4. Gets +1 +0 ++ +1/+0 for each creature we have out in the battlefield, and then whenever we attack, we get a 1/1 token in the process. Then we also have one copy of Minsk. It's a beloved ranger. It's a 3-mana 3/3 Naya color legendary creature that when it enters the battlefield, we get a 1/1 legendary hamster token named Boo with trample and haste. And then we can tap X until end of turn. Target creature we control has base power and toughness of X and becomes a giant in addition to its other types. Then we can activate this only as a sorcery. And what this is good about is that we can just turn one of our creatures into this giant, massive creature. And then if it has additional +1/+1 counters on it, it's going to be that much bigger of a creature and just gets in that additional damage in that sense. And it kind of gives us a good way to, even for 1 mana, we can give target creature a base power and toughness of 1/1, which is not very good, but you can turn like Hopeful Initiate, if it doesn't have any +1/+1 counters on it, into like a 2/2 or a 3/3 if you have the additional mana. After that, we have Helena and Helena Partners, a 4-mana 2/3 for a strike reach card. Gotta get another strong card in the green-red colors. At the beginning of our combat, we get to put X +1/+1 counters on another creature we control, where X is the power of Helena and Helena's power, and this creature gains haste into end of turn, so you can immediately turn on a creature that may have come into the battlefield after Helena and Helena Partners have been out in the battlefield, and then allowing them to get plus counters is always very good, because if your opponent doesn't deal with this creature that was getting bigger and bigger, it's going to be something that's going to overrun them, and then we just have this big creature on the battlefield. We also have Sigarda, Champion of the Light, a 4-mana 4/4 angel creature. It's not a human, though it does have fly and trample and gives all humans we control +1/+1. It also has a Covenant ability that whenever it attacks, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you get to look at the top 5 cards of our library. We can reveal a human creature card among them, put it into our hand, and put the rest in the bottom of our library in a random order, allowing us to kind of dig a little bit deeper. If we run out of creatures on the in our hand to cast, this will allow us to get a little bit deeper into our deck, find a new creature to cast, and maybe follow up on the following turn to cast something. Mana base is, yet again, because we are playing 3 colors, is a little sloppy, not a lot of basics. We have 3 Caves of the Frost Dragons, 1 Aganjo for the possibility of using it as removal, as well as a white mana source, 2 Plains, 1 Rockfall Vale, 4 of the white-red pathways, 1 Sundown Pass, 4 of the white-green pathways, 4 of the Overgrown Farmlands, and 4 copies of the Secluded Courtyard. Yet again, a very, very strong deck. The reason why it's at number 2 and not number 1 is that, really, to be quite honest, the deck that's at number 1, this deck is still weak against that, even if this deck looks super powerful on paper, and that is going to be the Boros Burn. Yet again, a deck that I think is, it's not also popular. It did have a peak at one point, I think, before Shoots into Capenna of about 10%. But since new Capenna's come out, it's kind of sitting about, 4% of the meta. But yet again, and I don't know if I went over the numbers in this deck, but, in 59,000 matches, it also has a 59% win rate. There's been 9 iterations of this deck in that time. And yet again, it does very well. It does about 50% against mono white. It's a 60% against, Naya Runes. And like I said, its real weak point in the current way the meta is going to be against the Boros Burn, because that deck has just been super aggressive and it doesn't have a lot of plays. And I think a lot of decks haven't really adjusted to kind of combat a Boros Burn style deck. But overall, still a great deck. If you choose this deck over any of the other decks in this video, it's still a great choice, regardless of its matchup against Boros Burn. So the next deck up on the list is yet again another surprise. This is a deck I piloted myself at one point, like I think last week or this past weekend, and it's Boros Burn. This deck has been on its kind of rise in the meta. It's kind of like that mono red deck that we haven't had in a while, as it is kind of like a very quick deck. The games really don't last long with this deck. It's either you're going to win or you're going to lose, because this deck is that fast of a deck in that sense. It has a win rate currently of 60.3, so it's the only deck that's above 60 in the win rate, in about 80,000 matches. Average match durations is a little over 4 minutes, a little under 4.5 minutes at 4.4 minutes. There have been 20 iterations of the deck, but this is, I believe, similar to the list I ran when I did the video on this deck list, so I'll probably post that in, as a card above if you want to check out some gameplay of this deck if you haven't crafted it yet. But overall, very, very good deck. It, has a 50% chance against mono white. It has a 59% against Naya Runes. It also has, a 58% against Naya Humans, which is that kind of right below it in the meta. So overall, it's a very, very strong deck in that sense. It does very, very well. I mean, the only 2 decks that look like that it's like decks that look like it's underneath 50% is Mono Green Stompy, which I guess is because it's big creatures and slows down a lot of big haster creatures, because haster creatures usually aren't very, very big. But other than that, that's really the only list that it plays against that it's not very strong against, and that's just because creatures are bigger in mono green. Overall, the deck is a fun deck to play if you're looking for something that's super aggressive and just trying to play some quick games at Magic. But yet again, the introduction of some red into the deck has kind of gave, these these cards kind of that extra life. I mean, it's kind of crazy that there's a card in the deck, Sunrise Cavalier, that came out with the Crimson Vow, but I feel like a lot of people, it's like, oh, this is a limited card. It's not really like a card that's going to be played in a standard meta deck. But overall, this deck is pretty cool. You got 4 copies of Hopeful Initiate, a 1-mana 1/2 with Training, and combined with this deck and cards that can also be played on the turn after, and then being able to train with those other cards, like, if you played a Hopeful Initiate on turn 1 and then on turn 2 you drop a Bloodthirsty Adversary, well, you're going to hit for 4 damage on turn 2, which is definitely pretty impressive, and definitely, putting a lot of pressure on your opponent very, very quickly. But, you got 4 copies of this. We have 4 copies of Kumano Faces of Kakazan, 1-mana Enchantment Saga that when it enters the battlefield deals 1 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control. On chapter 2, target creature is the next creature that enters the battlefield under our control. It gets an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So you play Hopeful Initiate on turn 1, or you play this on turn 1. You follow it up with one of our turn 2 plays. That creature now enters the battlefield as not just like a Luminarch Aspirant as a 2/2 immediately, or you get this as a 3/3, which is definitely very good. We have Play with Fire to do damage to your opponent's face or to any target they may control. Also, if we do damage to our opponent's face, we get the Scry one, fix the top card of our library, looking for an additional threat. This deck doesn't need a lot of mana to really get going, so you can get rid of a lot of your lands if you already have like your 3 lands or so at this point, and kind of look for more threats and kind of put more pressure on your opponent. You got 4 copies of Luminarch Aspirant, yet again, like I said, it's a great card for this style of deck because it's just going to make our creatures that much stronger, even itself. Valor stands here, a 1-off in the deck, just in case you need that indestructibility or destroy something that may be bigger than it in its way. Bloodthirsty Adversary, initially can be our 2-drop haster, that's a 2/2. Or if we get into the later game and we have some non-creature spells in the our graveyard, we can cap an additional 3 mana as many times as we can. We put an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and we also get to cast target instant or sorcery spell, mana value 3 or less from our graveyard, and copy it and cast it to any target that we want without paying its mana cost. So definitely pretty cool there. Got Royal Eruption as a sorcery spell here for 2 mana that deals 3 damage to any target, and if it was kicked, we can deal 5 damage. But 2 mana, 3 damage is definitely very good, even if at sorcery speed. We have Brutal Cathar that's going to hopefully get things out of our way if we attack in against our opponent, which is definitely very good. And then itself, if our opponent's not playing a lot of things, we can flip it over. It has First Strike. They have to pay 3 life in order to target it directly. And it, at this point, it's a possibility they may not have much life to pay, so it's kind of hard to spot removal it without some sort of global board wipe. Then, like I said, we had the Sunrise Cavalier, a card, like I said, that hasn't seen a lot of play, I feel like, in the meta. Kind of before this, that kind of, hit its way up the meta list as a whole. It's a 3-mana 3/3 Trample Haster. Trample's great into this style of deck because it gets through chump blockers that your opponent may play. If it's neither day or night, it becomes day as it enters the battlefield, and whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, it puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature control, whether it's itself or other creatures may have on the battlefield, so just making it bigger every time the day-night cycle happens. And then in the 4-drop slot, we have Thunder and Raju, 4-mana 3/3, has haste. Whenever it attacks, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control, and then it deals X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of modified creatures we control other than Thunder and Raju. So, even before we play this, if we have 3 creatures out in the battlefield that have +1/+1 counters on it, then we play Thunder and Raiju. Not only are we going to deal damage with our creatures, we're going to deal 3 damage immediately to our opponent, which is definitely very, very good. And then yet again, for a dual color deck, the mana base is okay, especially if we get against some sort of land destruction deck. But we have 1 copy of Laganja for maybe that spot removal spell, 7 plains, 2 copies of Den of the Bugbear, 6 mountains, 1 Sokuzan Crucible Defiance. We have 2 Snarls. I mean, it's a possibility that you could get away with, playing the farmland, but I guess they think that you have a land that produces red or white mana that comes in the battlefield untapped if we actually show a basic is better. But yet again, like I said, if you have the red-white duel from Crimson Vow, you can play that instead. And then we also have 4 copies of the red-white Pathway, which is also very good. This deck has just been on the rise, I think, in the more recent times. At the start of Streets of New Capenna, no one was playing this deck. It was sitting at, I think, a 0.5%, which is barely anybody, especially when you think about the overall population of the game. But as of today, at the recording of this video, it's sitting at about 11.4%, which is definitely crazy. And it's been about, we're about almost a month into Streets of New Capenna, and just to see a deck that's just kind of just jumped up so drastically over that time is definitely kind of seeing how powerful the deck is. And like I said, the overall win rate is kind of just sitting above a 60%, which is definitely very good if you're looking for someone to grind the ladder, kind of rank up quickly. It does very well against the majority of the meta decks out there. Like I said, the only weird deck that hasn't been in the meta as a whole, it kind of was at one point, is the mono green matchup. But like I said, that's just a matchup where if they get big things out in your way, it's kind of hard unless we have a lot of answers like Brutal Cathars and stuff to kind of get those things out of our way. But yet again, it's a very good deck. Just to kind of throw it out there, guys, I have all the deck lists for these decks in the description below if you want to check them out for yourself and kind of try them out. If you've already started playing these decks or you played these decks before in the past, let me know, what you think about each of these decks. Is it kind of surprising that these decks are kind of at the top of the meta? Let me know in the comments below. It's also one of those things that kind of shows you how drastically different, if you've kind of looked at anything from the championships for Streets into Capenna, the decks were a little bit slower, and that's also in a best of 3. But when you look at best of 1, the decks are just more aggressive. These decks play very well, whether on the play or the draw, which is definitely kind of interesting. But yet again, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video.